every 10 minutes. So I'm the one speaker today who's going to encourage you to let your minds wander. My starting premise is that sex is good, and that good sex is a gift. Sex might be one of the most joyous activities many of us ever participate in. We are sexual beings, and our bodies, no matter the size, shape, age, or condition, are beautiful. Sex serves a lot of purposes. Procreation is one, pleasure is another, feeling loved, accepted, and finding emotional fulfillment is another. Sex can also play a role in our spirituality. We are whole beings, both body and spirit, so the way we use our bodies is an expression of our spirituality. Some people choose to express their spirituality by practicing celibacy. Despite overwhelming messages to the contrary, you can be whole without a sexual partner. And all the world's traditions have seen value in claiming that way of life. There are other ways we use our bodies to express our spirituality: dancing, athletics, fasting, and feasting are examples. We also might follow the path of sexual transcendence, where we leave the boundaries of our individual self in order to experience firsthand the creative impulse of the universe. But sex alone is no guarantee of transcendence. In order for sex to be a gift, two people must make themselves vulnerable to each other. It can't be had when one is being exploited or when love is withheld. It can't be had when sex is being used as a means to any other end than mutual reverence and delight. What a fine line there is between sex that heals and sex that harms. And trying to hold those two realities together is difficult. In our post-sexual liberation world, a lot of taboos have fallen aside, and many people are having and presumably enjoying sex. At the same time, we hear a whole litany of warnings. Sex is dangerous. Sexual desire is wrong. Female sexuality is evil and destructive. Male sexuality is predatory and uncontrollable. It is the task of every civilized human being to confine sex within very narrow limits. But to think of sex as somehow bad or dirty or wrong is like thinking we are bad or dirty or wrong. With that kind of foundation, we're almost certain to end up feeling shame for our own perfectly natural impulses, desires, and fulfillments. Negative social conditioning about sex creates fear. And fear is passed down generation to generation by well-intentioned parents, teachers, and leaders. Watch out. The dangers are all around you. If you open up to love and sex more fully, you will get hurt. When I was growing up, those very narrow limits meant that the only time it was okay to even think about having sex was after I was married. That message and the veil of guilt that draped over me kept me from having important conversations with trusted elders, including my mother, about my own blossoming sexuality. And it led me to make some pretty devastating choices in my life. My problem wasn't that I had sex with a lot of people. It was that I felt compelled to marry anyone I had sex with. I was in a catch-22. Because of my early experiences with childhood sexual abuse and the social messaging that I was hearing, I didn't believe anybody could be interested in me if they didn't have access to my body. But once I had sex, I was so filled with guilt that the only way to make it better was to get married. Today, I feel more strongly than ever that we have to find a way to talk openly, honestly, and above all, realistically about sex. And we have to have these conversations with our young people. It's just too confusing. One minute our culture is trying to demean sex, exploit it, use it as a marketing campaign, and turn it into a sport. The next minute it's trying to vilify sex and repress it. How are we supposed to make our way with these contradictory and confusing messages of our times? Navigating our sex life is difficult. And in the process, we might entrust ourselves to somebody who is not careful with our bodies or our spirits. Our society has tried to hold these mixed messages in place by advocating and promoting a marriage ethic. According to a marriage ethic, if you are married, sex with your partner is acceptable. And if you're not married, sex is bad. But this has nothing to say to single young people. It has nothing to say to the widowed or divorced. It has nothing to say to gay and lesbian individuals who aren't even allowed to get married in our state. It has nothing to say to the single elderly or the single disabled. It has nothing to say to anybody who isn't, well, married. And at the same time, it implicitly condones a whole host of abusive, demeaning, and controlling behaviors as long as they take place within a legally recognized union. A sexual ethic assumes that the purpose and ultimate goal of marriage is sex, and that the purpose and ultimate goal of sex is lifelong bonding. Traditionally, marriage was an economic arrangement with a provision for raising children. Men used their financial means to secure sex. Women used sex to establish economic security and fulfill their mothering role. But in these relationships, two people often felt like they owned each other and had a right to control each other's behavior. We're not property, and we don't get to control each other. If we're going to learn to relate to each other as whole human beings, then I advocate that it's time we begin developing a sexual ethic that celebrates sex while treating it with moral integrity. A sexual ethic that begins by recognizing that every human being, no matter their sexual orientation, their marital status, or their physical capacity, has the right to enjoy sex as part of a healthy and life-giving part of their existence. A sexual ethic is in some ways individualized. There are some things that are right for me that might not be right for you, and vice versa. But by taking the time to craft my ethic, I know now consciously what is right for me. Because crafting a sexual ethic requires discernment and intentionality as we consider how we will be sexual beings in this world and how we will respond to the needs, desires, and pains of our bodies. Other parts of a sexual ethic are universal. For instance, every time we have sex, there must be mutual consent. Consent is never the same as acquiescing, going along with, or submitting to. Genuine consent requires communication, an agreement that yes means yes, no means no, and maybe means maybe. No will not be punished with withdrawal or coercive tactics. And maybe requires waiting for yes without manipulation or pushing. A sexual ethic also recognizes that we need to have a degree of physical and emotional maturity to engage in sex. Rather than setting an arbitrary age of consent, we need to be able to reflect reasonably on our situation. Maturity brings with it a level of self-identity. All of us know teenagers who have been filled with angst as they try to figure out who they are. They will not find themselves in sex. Likewise, those of you as old as me know that we also have times of doubt and wonder when we're not sure who we are. We also will not find ourselves in sex. A sexual ethic also requires taking responsibility for protecting ourselves and our partner from sexually transmitted disease and unplanned pregnancy. This cannot be done effectively in the act or the morning after, but requires the kind of communication and consideration that's born out of respect for ourselves and for our partner. A sexual ethic also requires that the power and vulnerability of two people be equal. Now, certainly, we will find ourselves attracted at times to people with more or less power than we have, but we have a choice whether to act on that. If we have sex with somebody in a position of power over us, or a person whom we have power over, chances are somebody's going to end up getting taken advantage of. A sexual ethic also requires a level of relational maturity. For some people, that'll be marriage. For others, it'll mean knowing somebody enough to trust them. When we're willing to make a commitment and ready to do that, whatever the nature of the commitment and whatever its duration, it must be anchored in fidelity. We might change in ways over time that change the commitment we're willing to make to somebody else. But when that happens, we also have to address it openly and honestly. And we can only do that if there is first and foremost a foundation based on truth-telling, promise-keeping, and dependability. Finally, a marriage ethic recognizes that sex is supposed to be both other-enriching and self-liberating. We give the gift of sex, which is kind and caring and compassionate, but we also receive the gift of sex. Sex is meant to be a joyous celebration without feelings of guilt and remorse. Ultimately, a sexual ethic says that I will not meet my needs at the expense of somebody else. And it recognizes that there are no easy answers and no permanent resolutions, but that we enter into a time of perpetual discernment. And that's a big head start as we navigate our sex lives today. It grieves me that so many have taught for so long a separation of body and spirit. The idea that pursuing our sexuality will hinder our spiritual growth. The idea that sex is somehow dirty or unclean or sinful has robbed countless people of a truly transcendent taste of the creative passion of the universe. I can only think of one other thing that has so damaged what should be a natural embrace of our sex lives, and that's the sex industry. Veiled in the disguise of liberation and freedom from oppression, the sex industry thrives on the exploitation of human beings. And it's become so pervasive, it's as if we actually believe everybody in the trade is there by choice. What used to be shocking is now acceptable. And to not tolerate the objectification of human beings is to be labeled a prude or worse. Living by a sexual ethic destroys the illusion that we are not responsible for the darkness in society, that our actions are ours alone, that we are not intimately connected to every human being on this planet. Because that paradigm hurts everybody, men, women, and children. Those who suffer racism, sexism, poverty, and homelessness, and victims of domestic violence, rape, and incest are the most vulnerable to that abuse. All of us have a sexual history, for good or for ill. Sex, while tied to the body, is never purely physical. Sex brings up in us emotions, memories, fragments of the past, hopes, and longings. As we grow and mature, we can find even richer and deeper meaning in our sexual encounters. We are invited by the universe to love our bodies, to relish sex, and to marvel in this very good gift. Living by a sexual ethic frees us to be fully body and fully spirit, to know the wonder of being a truly whole and holy person. Namaste.